Excellencies, dear guests, dear speakers, dear researchers, dear students, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all of you. It really is heartening to have you in this big number. And on behalf of the organizing committee of this conference, Arab Spring 7 years on, and also on behalf of our house, Jazeera Balkans, I would like to welcome you all to this conference. Sarajevo Talks is a new platform aiming to offer new media for researchers, journalists, experts in the field, opinion makers, to provide the media for them to exchange the ideas with the public and also public to reflect on. And so we decided to have this very first conference in a series of conferences in this very hall. And we are thankful to the Memorial Center who kindly offered this venue for us. And I believe this is a great place for such events. With our speakers last night, we have spoken and we basically stated the obvious, that Sarajevo is an excellent venue. Sarajevo is called upon to send these messages to the world, not only on Arab Spring, but on many other topics. And definitely we will keep you posted. We will have our conferences and we will let you know. Sarajevo Talks, as I said, is a new platform, and writing to the mayors to get the permission from them, because every town has a name, and those names, if you use, there are some procedures. So we have written to them. They have kindly responded, and we are thankful to them also to use the name of Sarajevo. As I said, Sarajevo is a very good brand, a charming place, plus with its people, inhabitants, who are very hospitable. Definitely this is a great venue for us to send not only messages, but also nice pictures from our beautiful city. Well, there are many people that I definitely need to thank for this conference to take place. First of all, you, because you came, this is a working hour and this is a working day, so thank you all. The mere fact that you came in this number is also telling us that we need to continue our work. I also need to thank my organizing team, who I was bothering for the last 50 days or so. But don't worry, guys, I'll keep bothering you more. Beyond that, basically, today we gathered to address the very important topic, Arab Spring 7 years on, and we are really delighted to have speakers who have something to say. So I'm really grateful to them that they made time and effort to be with us. I know their schedules are very busy. Some of them, they have to leave right after the conference, which is a miss. And I hope they will come back, so we'll have some more time. So starting with Mr. David Hurst, who's editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. We are so honored to have him here. There is no important conference, symposia, or panel on the Middle East that he is not invited. So we are really, this is not his first time. He was here also during the war, during difficult time, and he says pictures are somewhat different. I'm sure he will share some of these today with us. We also have with us Mr. Galib Dalai, the director of the Shark Forum, but also very much present in the many symposia organized by German tanks. For some reasons, German government is investing heavily in think tanks. Perhaps we can address that as well today. And also on our far left side, we have Mr. Kamal Alam, visiting fellow at Rusi Institute. As you know, Rusi Institute is one of the eldest think tanks in the world. And I know Kamal was traveling from the States 2 nights ago. He came to London and he just changed, took his new robes, and he kindly came all the way to Sarajevo, again, having another 2 flights, so without rest. So thank you very much, Kamal, for making that effort. We also have our own Ahmet Alibasic from Bosnia, who is a lecturer at the Faculty of Islamic Studies, but who also specializes in this topic, Arab Springs, appraisals, oppositions, and he's also the president of the Center for Advanced Studies, and we are happy to have him as well today with us. Last but not least, maybe I'm biased, but we are really thankful for our director of Al Jazeera Network to be with us. We somehow encouraged and also motivated him to be, because we believe he has so many things to say. Not many people have met actual figures and actual actors of the Sarajevo of Arab Spring, but Adham Forcho definitely did, and we are honored to have him as well here. Of course, we have our Harun Karčić, who is our journalist, but who is also making his name with East borders, and we are definitely happy to have him chair this panel today with us. I also need to express my gratitude to the press that came. I was surprised that almost every media house in Sarajevo was here to interview us and to take some statements. So I thank the press, and I thank our own media house, Al Jazeera Balkans, and also particularly Al Jazeera Mubashir, who is taking live signal from us and airing us in so many households throughout the world. Last but not least, definitely a man who was supporting the idea of Sarajevo Talks from the very beginning, and who definitely was helping us throughout, and who is here with us, the director of Al Jazeera Balkans, who I would kindly invite to the stage to address the audience, Mr. Tarik Đorđić.
Ja ću na bosanskom. Evo, Edin rekao da budemo kratki, ali ja ću biti malo kraći nego on. Moja nana je imala jednu kletvu da Bog da se o sebi zabavili. U svim ovim previranjima bosanskim političkim mi smo se nekako previše o sebi zabavili, pa smo zaboravili da postoji i ostali svijet, i zaboravili smo da je između ostalog i ova zemlja opstala i ostala zahvaljujući i ovakvim konferencijama diljem svijeta. Ja se nadam da ćemo mi ovaj panel učiniti regularnim, da ćemo i kao Al Jazeera iz njega izvući neki profit i na neki način Sarajevo vratiti na međunarodnu mapu svijeta. Posebno se zahvaljujem Memorijalnom centru Kovači i našim gostima i želim uspješan rad. Hvala.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, once again, hello and welcome to Sarajevo Talks, presented to you by Al Jazeera Balkans. My name is Harun Karčić, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion on the Arab Spring 7 years on. Now, the Middle East has been very turbulent since 2011. Dictators, but also democratically elected presidents have been toppled. Anti-government revolutions have morphed into armed rebellions. Armed rebellions have metastasized into wars that killed hundreds of thousands of people, crossed natural and man-made boundaries, razed towns and cities, sliced up countries, but also generated humongous refugee flows. These wars also drew in regional and international powers, thereby creating more conflict actors. And to help us make sense of what is happening in the region today, I'm joined by a wonderful lineup of experts from around the world who have been introduced to you already. Allow me to begin with Adham Forcho. Adham, looking back at the Arab Spring from today's perspective, it is clear that popular uprisings can force out dictators. But why has it been so difficult to make a smooth transition from dictatorship to democracy? Why did so many countries slide back into new dictatorships or outright anarchies?
First of all, I also want to thank the audience for coming. Thank you for this very difficult question. You know, if I knew this, I would be one of the smartest people in the world. The fact is that the Middle East, or let's say the broader Middle East that stretches somewhere from far west, North Africa, all the way to Iran, went through dramatic changes in the years 2010, 2011, until today. The fact is also that all of those countries were ruled by non-democratic rulers. Algeria had a fair election in 1991. There was an attempt to bring democracy to the Arab world. They really responded in droves. It was fantastic turnout, everything, but then they were not happy with the outcome. In 1991 Algerian elections, party that won, that was certain to win 2/3 majority in the parliament was what they considered at that time Islamist party or pro-Islamic party, and they said, look, if these guys come, even though through democratic means, we think they will not be democratic tomorrow, they will change the whole system, let's overthrow them. You know, this logic was supported by the West en masse, and that first and probably the only real democratic election that Algeria had went through, and the junta that removed the government of Algeria is, I mean, more or less ruling until today. Morocco is a monarchy, which is after Arab Spring now becoming a little bit more democratized. Tunisia was dictatorship that in the times of Habib Bourguiba and Zain al-Abidin bin Ali has been ruled for more than 55 years by, or maybe 60 years, ruled by two guys, dictators. Libya, Muammar Qaddafi ruled it for 42 years. He's a military guy. Egypt, all the people were military officers that ruled it. And Hosni Mubarak at that point in time was in power 30 years. Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh ruled North Yemen before that, and then continued ruling Yemen for about 35 years. I mean, the other Gulf states are monarchies. Jordan is a monarchy. Syria was ruled and still is ruled by Assad family, father and son team. All the others were planning to be ruled by father and son team. Gaddafi was grooming his son to take over. Mubarak was grooming his son to take over. Ali Abdullah Saleh was grooming his son to take over. In Iraq, Saddam was grooming his son to take over. He was removed by different means. So the situation was not good. Sometimes in this region, there is this romanticized version of what these countries were before, because some of the people from former Yugoslavia used to work and live in Libya, Iraq, etc. And they say, oh, these were fantastic countries and the systems are fantastic. Are you a Libyan or are you an Iraqi? Do you know how many people disappeared at night? Do you know about the secret prisons? Do you know the massive abuse in which billions are stolen for the pleasure of one family? If this happens here, would you appreciate it? Of course not. And can you imagine people have been living in these oppressive regimes for decades? This is why the Arab Spring happened. Of course, it started from Tunisia. It spread everywhere. And it brought new light. It raised morale of people of Middle East. And they started believing that there is better tomorrow. You know, in 2010, if you told a well-informed insider of any of these countries, there will be a change. If you told somebody in 2010 that Hosni Mubarak in 1 year will not be president, or that Gaddafi will not be the ruler of Libya, they will say you're crazy. In 1 year, there was no signs whatsoever that these revolutions could take place. And they did. Of course, the first round of enthusiasm was maybe a little bit overstated. It's not fair to expect of any country, so that includes the Middle Eastern ones, that they will have a change from autocracy to some freedom and functioning democracy overnight. They expected that. They expected suddenly everything will be rosy. Of course, it's not like that. First, we have to question the competency of the new players. Second, do you think the remnants of old regime will let go? Of course not. They have the means that they have accumulated over decades in power. So they will not let go. They did not let go. They after the first shock, so Tunisian, Libyan, Egyptian, Yemeni governments were changed, those guys that opposed these changes in Middle East, because it became too close also for the monarchies. Let's face it, Tunisia was a monarchy at one point in time. Libya was a monarchy, so the Gulf states and other monarchies could think this can happen to me as well. Morocco gave some compromises. The others refused. And certain Gulf states were up in the arms against any kind of revolutions that were happening there. They had means to finance what we can call counter-revolutions. And unfortunately, they have succeeded to a large extent. I mean, they succeeded in destroying this first wave of democracy that came to many countries in the Middle East. It is now a very bad situation. We know Yemen, it's a disastrous situation in Yemen. You have an anarchy, and Yemen is facing a prospect of being broken into two again. We have the same situation in Libya. You have something that resembles a civil war. Country is facing a situation where it can be split up. You have Syria, which has suffered by far the most. And that Syrian crisis is not only affecting Syria, it's affecting dozens of other countries all over the world.
Just bring in David at this moment.
Yes, please.
David, the Gulf monarchies that killed off the Arab Spring, did they do it for fear of the safety of their own regimes, or because the wrong political parties came to power, in this case the Islamist movements, and would they have behaved the same way had secular or nationalist parties won free elections?
They haven't killed off the Arab Spring.
Why?
It's still going on. The idea is still there. What the Arab Spring, I think, provided was a fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of all sorts of very illegitimate states. It's based on the oil era. The oil era created the rentier state. We all know what that state involves. It involves a press that is entirely dominated, has its lines written for it by the Mukhabarat, by the secret police. That's their idea of free expression. The Emirati ambassador to Russia actually said it in an interview with The Guardian. He said, I don't believe in free speech. The Arabs aren't ready for free speech. They say this stuff openly. And your jaw drops open-mouthed that someone who, in the internet age, says that hundreds of millions of people aren't ready for free speech. That's what he said. And that's what they actually believe. And what they're providing, or what they're trying to provide, is they're trying to modernize autocracy. They're not modernizers of states, they're modernizers of dictatorship. And they're using the internet and the most sophisticated techniques to reinvent autocracy in the internet age. So I don't think the Arab Spring is dead. I think we were very naive about it. I think this is a real revolution going on. It's as fundamental as the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's as fundamental as the wave of protests and revolts in Latin America. It's big. It's on a very, very big scale, and these things will take time. I mean, the French Revolution took a lot of time. The European Revolution in 1848 took a lot of time. The Arab Spring lacks the mechanisms to translate protest into institutions. They were bad at governance. They didn't have the tools to start and to continue what was started. And even in the best example of the Arab Spring, which is Tunisia, where an internal dialogue has been taking place for 3-4 years between secular and Islamist forces. And there is now a framework for governance, even there where it is very, very fragile. I would say, where's an economic policy? Which jobs are you creating for the youth? Why are so many Tunisians outside Tunis joining Daesh and continue to join Daesh? There's lots and lots of problems with Tunisia. But in terms of going back to the question, the Gulf states got a fundamental shock from the Arab Spring, simply because it could happen there. If it could happen in a fruit cellar in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia, it could happen literally anywhere in Saudi Arabia itself. And what they did very cleverly and extremely ruthlessly was they rushed to London and they then rushed to Washington. They built up paid for a network of PR lobby agencies that still exist to this day, who then started hiring journalists, who then started undermining the idea that democracy would provide stability. And exactly the same people and exactly the same journalists now are praising bin Salman's latest visit to London, which he regarded as a great success, and there's now going to be a visit to America. I think, however, so the counter-revolution is really in full swing. It's been extremely violent reaction, both externally and internally, and that violence has basically shattered states that were already pretty weak to start with. So you have a whole series of failed states. There's also a lot of chaos, particularly in Saudi Arabia. I mean, just to go through some of the things that happened in Saudi Arabia. First, King Abdullah immediately posited the Brotherhood as the existential threat to Saudi Arabia, and they left Iran and they left Yemen. Abdullah dies, there is a palace coup, and some of Abdullah's right-hand men, who, for instance, people like Tuajeri, but also Prince Meteb as well, who were part of the nexus of contacts with the Emiratis and with Egypt, lost power. So immediately after Salman became king, and there was quite dramatic scenes particularly in the hospital where King Abdullah was dying, in which Tuajeri tried to get the king, who was completely unconscious, to sign a decree basically writing Salman out of the will. So there's a real power struggle going on, involving doctors, involving weird and wonderful scenes in the royal hospital. And bin Zayed lost, for a small amount of time, he lost his means of communication with Riyadh. He had to reinvent that. How did he reinvent it? He reinvented it through his alliance with a young prince who was then 30, who's now going to be king. That's how he did it. But for a long period of time, he lost contact. But he never gave up, and he became the mentor of bin Salman. And he basically said, first thing you've got to do, three things you've got to do to become king. You've got to make contact and keep contact with Israel. You've got to make contact and keep contact with Washington. And you've got to get rid of your elder cousin, who was a Washington favorite. So this was it was a really chaotic, primitive structure. There's no government involved in this. He's done all of these things. But there is chaos, absolute chaos in its wake. So if you talk about Saudi foreign policy, or you talk in relation to Lebanon, in relation to Qatar, in relation to any of its neighbors, in relation to Jordan. I just come back from Jordan, and they're furious at the Saudis, or what the Saudis are doing. A, the Saudis haven't paid them a penny for the last 2 years, not even oil money. B, there's Jerusalem. C, there's the whole thing about custodianship. They're absolutely furious. And that's Jordan, right? There's Jordan, no lover of either the Brotherhood or political Islam in any way, and it's also a monarchy, and it's also pro-Western, and also there's the British military involvement as well.
We'll get back to Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed soon, but let me ask a question to Professor Ahmed Al-Bashic. Now, you mentioned the French Revolution. Ahmed, the French Revolution itself had its own counter-revolutionaries and the reign of terror. Now, the counter-revolutions that we are witnessing today in Egypt, in Libya, and in Yemen, do you see them as being merely an intermezzo, or do you believe that disenfranchised masses will rise up again in the future?
I mean, we shouldn't overplay analogies because in history things don't really repeat themselves 100% the same way. But similarities are really difficult to miss between what is going on in the Arab world and not just French Revolution. All major movements and developments in the 20th processes in around the world and in the West in particular speak about civil rights movement, speak about struggle against communism in Eastern Europe and any other process you like. You know, people tend to remember the last chapter, the happy end usually. What they often forget is the difficult struggle and series of setbacks and failures on the way to that happy end. So to go back to the French Revolution, I think, you see, French Revolution started very optimistically. There was an initial success. There was a declaration of rights of man and citizen, and it looked like, okay, we are there very soon. And then 25 years of chaos started. Excessive violence, reign of terror, civil war, international wars. Napoleon ended up in Cairo, in Moscow. International alliance was created by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria-Hungary, Metternich, to, you know, stop this and to take things back. And that's what eventually happened. At the end of the 25 years of chaos, what we had the old regimes reinstated. So it must have looked to the people back then that it's, well, I mean, what did we do for a quarter of a century? Nothing. We are back to zero. But that wasn't so, actually. The path to freedom, if you like, was charted. The days of the old regimes were counted. Yes, a delayed effect, but then that was it. Now, there is, I think, if we are talking about similarities, I would like to point a major difference between French Revolution and the Arab Revolution. We tend now to forget that all the Arab, these uprisings were initially very peaceful. Okay, what people really cared about is to have change, not necessarily to punish the old regimes, or that was not the point. They became violent only when they were provoked or when no other option was left. So I think this is very important to remember how it started and how it became violent. It didn't start violent.
Now, Galip, Turkey was one of the optimists when the anti-government revolution started. Would you say that rather than managing to project its influence throughout the Middle East, Ankara is now more isolated than ever? And who is to blame? Regional factors or the Turkish government?
Well, first of all, it's great to have such a large audience for Arab uprisings still. So in recent times, I haven't seen that much audience even in the Arab world. So it's good that there is hope in Balkans. So the question of Turkey and the Arab uprising is very much related to the evolution of Arab uprising itself. As Ustaz has just put it, like, you know, what was Arab uprising in 2010? When in Tunisia, when we discussed Tunisia and Egypt in 2010-11, we did not discuss who she or he was, you know, whether she was seculars, Islamists, Christian, Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Arabs. We discussed what they wanted. So it was a demand-based discussion. So the political demands, the socio-economic demands was what we were discussing, not their identities. And the fact that later, and it was peaceful, as you said, but unfortunately later, this movement was transformed from a political-based demands to identity struggle across the regions. Then we start to discuss, like, you know, the Shia, Sunni, Arab, Kurds, etc., taking, you know, fighting each other in Syria. And it became militarized and it became sectarianized. This is where the old regime has thrived, and this is where actually Turkey start to, you know, start to lose ground. Because Turkey in 2010-11, for Turkey it was much easier to associate itself at this stage with the demands of the people, because it did recognize this political history. But when it comes to an identity struggle and a military one, Turkey did not have this know-how, or Turkey did not have this DNA of a state that can operate in a very chaotic context with identity wars ongoing and in a very militarist context very well. And this is like, what has happened. And at this stage, yes, compared to 2010-11, the Turkish role has become lessened significantly. It is playing relatively a peripheral role, and you can see this in the discourse of the government, you can see this in the geographic scope of its influence. Like in 2010-11, we discussed like, Arab world or the Arab uprising as a phenomena that was taking place from North Africa all the way to the Gulf, etc. So the geographical scope of the discourse and the political activism was very wide. If you look at it in recent years, the geographic scope of the political activism is basically like runs from northern Iraq to northern Syria, and very much, it's the whether PKK, PYD, or Kurdish challenge, etc. And the language of Arab uprisings, and a process that will transform the region towards a much more humanitarian one and a democracy-centric one and human rights-centric one has replaced itself with a language of, the nation security challenges of all sorts that it's facing mentality. So this is a major transformation. But in this regard, I will not still say is that Turkey's role has lessened. But what we see across the region, no country's role is increasing. We see effectively three blocks emerging. One of them is what I call the authoritarian quartet, the Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, and which is very much like, has Trump and Israel on its side. The second one is the Iran-centric bloc, which is, incorporates both state and non-state actors, Iran, central Iraqi government, Hashishabi forces, Hezbollah, the Assad government, Houthis. And then another one, is what we can say like, the pro-Arab uprising countries, which is Turkey, Qatar, and some movements like, Ennahda or Muslim Brotherhood. And yes, right now, what we discuss in the region, the major battle we discuss is between the first group of the countries and the second group of the countries. So Saudi-Iranian axis, this is like one of them. Yes, it is true. This is one of the battle. And in this battle, Turkey doesn't have the major role. It plays a peripheral role, and it actually tries to adjust itself because this battle also creates so many countries in the region unhappy. I mean, look at, Kuwait, look at Oman, look at Lebanon. Lebanon is a country where one section of the society try to like, push it towards Iran axis, like Hezbollah. The other one is trying to push it towards, the Saudi axis. Another one try to like keep it in Lebanon. So there are many countries that is very much displeased with the Saudi-Iranian rivalries that we're there. And Turkey tried to appeal to them, whether in Sudan, whether with Kuwait, whether in Oman, etc. So this is right now what we are seeing that is that. But effectively, even these rivalry are being cast as a geopolitical rivalry. True, there is a geopolitical rivalry, particularly the Saudi Arabia feels that it has a status anxiety vis-a-vis Iran. It feels that it is losing the ground, which is true. If Saudi Arabia is losing ground, not because Iran is so smart, because Saudi Arabia is so stupid. So this is why it's losing the ground. So in this regard, but the major battle is still about what Arab uprising has promised. The fact that Saudi Arabia is investing billions and dollars in the West for the middle, the fact that a country like UAE tried to have a battle in Libya, put a blockade on Qatar, spent billions of dollars, what? How big was the challenge of Muslim Brotherhood to UAE? It's not very significant. But right now, the Arab Spring is a battle of political psychologies. It's paranoia, the political psychology, and that's why the Arab uprising is not about whether A person or B person has been toppled. The political psychology that they could not defeat. And this is why you see, the number of Muslim Brotherhood in total in UAE is not more than several hundreds. And you will see, in a rational analysis, we'll see this is crazy how much of treasury money that you're willing to spend on fighting an enemy that really does not exist in a very significant way. But this is the political psychology, the fear that Arab uprising has generated in the heart and minds of the regional autocrats. And this is why I believe the foundation of the political authoritarianism in the region today is much shakier than it used to be. And this is because there is a new political psychology which is not willing to accept what they previously had as their destiny.
Kamal, in the case of Syria, many analysts were predicting the fall of President Bashar al-Assad back in 2012. The year is 2018 now, and Assad is firmly in control of vast swaths of Syria. The number of sympathizers that he has in the West, in Europe, and the United States has been steadily rising over the last couple of months. In your opinion, what internal and external factors allowed him to maintain his grip on power despite all odds?
So I think Syria, of course, is very different to the other countries, and I think one of the biggest mistakes we continue to make is, even when we use the word Arab Spring, not all Arabs are the same. Someone selling fruit in Tunisia is not the same as someone selling fruit in Basra in the south of Iraq. The socioeconomic conditions are different. Sure, the theme might be the same. I think there was a very simplistic narrative, which is, dictator versus democracy, good versus evil. It's almost like when you watch a Tom and Jerry cartoon, and Tom is always bad and Jerry is always good. But sometimes Jerry also provokes Tom. But in the Syrian case, you talk about analysts. The three of the world's top Syria experts, Patrick Seal of Oxford University, David Leish of Trinity University, and Henry Kissinger, the famous or infamous Henry Kissinger, they warned in the first month of the Syria protests that Assad will not fall. This is not Libya, this is not Saddam, this is not Mubarak. Syria, Damascus is the heart of the Arab world. It's the oldest capital in the world. It still has some sense of Arab nationalism. And the support that Assad had remains to this day. Now, he has tremendous external support from the Russians and Iran, but one must also not forget the domestic support. Again, I go back to Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. These two American officials were the godfathers of US foreign policy in the Middle East. You go on C-SPAN, which is the US government website, and you look at the Armed Senate Services Committee from 2014. You have Brzezinski, you have Brent Stowcroft, another national security advisor for Ronald Reagan, and they said one thing, that it was complete lunacy to arm groups to fight Assad because he has more support than all the groups combined. Now Kissinger, Brzezinski, these aren't liberals. These are very hawkish people who've always implemented US policy in the Middle East. So there was this idea, first of all, that Assad would fall. It's completely wrong. He wouldn't have fallen. And he proved it. The Russians came in 2015. That was 4 years. Until 4 years, the biggest cities and the heart, even Aleppo, we look at a year and a half ago and the siege of Aleppo, 70% of Aleppo was with the government. On BBC, you can go on the BBC website now and look at March 2011. There's an article that says, why aren't there protests in Damascus and Aleppo? Because it took 6-7 months for the protests to start in Syria. Jonathan Steele of The Guardian, who's by no means an Assad apologist, one of the top British journalists, The Guardian wrote an article that the West is uncomfortable with the fact that there is genuine support for Assad. Now that doesn't mean what's happening is good or bad. So I think that's where the analysts got it wrong. And people say, oh, this is a Sunni v Shia war. Syria is not a Sunni Shia war because all the big Sunni families are with Assad. All the heads of intelligence are Sunni. The top generals are Sunni. What's happening is an international war. Of course, it's again an authoritarian government. There is no denying that. It's a military state, more like Algeria. Algeria is a 100% Sunni state, right? So is Libya, but yet people are killing each other. So the simplistic narrative that one person is evil incarnate and the others are, the amazing revolutionaries that will bring peace. That was one thing. Second of all, if you look at Syrian history and how Syria was a bridge of balance, we look at the Iran-Iraq war. One of the main reasons the Iran-Iraq war ended was because Hafiz al-Assad then spoke with the Saudis and the GCC to end the war. Hafiz was no friend of Saddam, of course. There was a Ba'ath Party rivalry. Yet in 1990, when the Americans needed the Syrians provided the bulk of the support to fight Saddam in Kuwait. Yet in 2003, when the Americans asked Bashar to help us in Iraq, the Syrians said, we're not going to help you. And actually, if you look at the trajectory of when people talk about Iran, Syria, the Syrian intelligence were always supporting Ayad Alawi, who was completely opposed to the sectarian groups of Maliki. And even now, if you ask most Iranians, Syrians and Iran clash in Iraq. You You look at the two biggest Sunni tribes in the east of Syria, Al-Jabur and Shammar. They are fully pro-Damascus. The Jordanian and Saudi tribal alliance asked these tribes, can you fight against Assad? They said, look, it's not about Assad, it's about Syria. We don't want what happened in Iraq, because you came into Iraq saying you liberate us, and what did you do? You know, Iraq is far worse than it was 10 years ago. So that's the main reason. The support coming in, as I said, the merchant class, the rich Sunni businessmen support Assad. In fact, the Turkish quarterly, there's a Turkish policy journal. If any of you are interested, I can send you articles. Even in 2012, there are articles coming, even in Turkish academia, saying the businessmen aren't leaving Assad, and all the top businessmen are Sunni. Going back even to Hafiz al-Assad, when he had a heart attack, his brother tried to do a coup. 8 of the big Syrian generals and the Sunnis stopped that coup. So it's a very simplistic argument that was used for Syria. Of course, now it's an international war. Assad has nothing to do with it. Now what we're seeing is a middle power game. China has become a big player. I'm in Damascus every second month. The Chinese have 1,000 soldiers in Syria because China see it as a threat to their security because they're Uyghur militants fighting in Syria. The biggest investor in Syria right now is China and India, Brazil and South Africa. So all the BRICS countries support Assad fully. So there's multiple reasons for that, because they saw Syria. Syria is the gateway, the Silk Road of the Arab world. Syria is where you have Turkey, Arab world coming in. You look at President Erdogan. He used to love Assad. He called him my brother. They spend their spring holidays together in the yachts, summer holidays. So even there, so all this war that we see, it's much more nuanced than using simplistic arguments. And this is why Assad is still there. He was very different. The Christian support. So the Christians are being massacred everywhere in the Arab world. Now, if you look at the United Nations figures of when the Americans moved into Iraq in 2003, there were 3 million Iraqi refugees in Syria. And the UN said that the Syrian government is looking after Iraqi refugees. This is a model of how one state should look after other refugees. So there are a lot of Iraqis that supported the Syrian government as well. Christians, Sunni, so it's not just one segment. And that's the main reason. You look at the Syrian army, it's the only army in the Arab world where the head of the army can be a Greek Orthodox, a Christian Catholic Maronite, or a Sunni or an Alawi. In that sense, the Balkans, you can look, the war in the Balkans, here we sit in Sarajevo. John Paul, the Pope, he went to Syria in 2002, and that speech is on YouTube. He visited all over Syria and said he saw harmony there, right? He's not there to talk about the political repression, etc., and no one denies that happened and continues to happen and will happen. But there was a harmony of faith. Syria should not be seen as an Islamic country. It was a Christian country. It's the only country in the world which speak the language of Jesus, Aramaic. The Christians and Muslims even intermarried in Syria, and that's why in the government you'll see a very cross-section of Sunnis, Christians. Sure, the president might be Alawi. Even his wife comes from one of the oldest families of Homs. They had 8 governors in Homs from that family, even in Ottoman times. So I think it's a simplistic argument. That's why the Syrian president, Algeria supports them. Algeria is a Sunni Arab military. Egypt support them. Indonesia, the largest Muslim country, their government fully supports Assad. Pakistan, the strongest army in the Islamic world, supports Assad, and it's a Sunni majority country. So there are many multiple reasons, and I think studying it, and if you ask most people in the West who are Syrian experts, they haven't been to Syria. They get paid by some think tank to say something. The Syrian experts I'm talking about are the ones that lived in Syria, like David Leish, who's an American, is at Trinity University. You have Joshua Landis at Oklahoma, and you have the senior American officials who said that. And even just recently, the former head of the British Army, General Richards, he said in an article which I wrote, I can send it to you, it's an army thing, RUSI is an army military think tank. What did he say? He said when the British Army conducted a survey, if Assad is going to fall, they said, well, actually, the army is not going to defect, the main of the army. And in February 2016, there was an opinion by the head of the Syrian opposition in the New York Times saying we should try for the Syrian army to defect. So basically, the Syrian opposition admitted defeat, that they hadn't managed to get the major Sunnis to defect. Right. That's why Assad is still in power.
Thank you so much. Well, moving on to the Gulf now. David, the Saudi and Emirati leaderships have dramatically overhauled their regional strategy in recent years. When did this shift in foreign policy happen and why? Why have they opted for more robust and proactive foreign policy?
Principally because they kept on redefining who the existential enemy was. It started out with being the Brotherhood, it then became Iran. There was a whole disintegration of Yemen, and it's been evolving ever since. One of the interesting things about the Yemen campaign is that it itself has split between the Emirati-backed militias in Aden and Hadi, who comes from the south, and he comes from Aden, and he is virtually a political prisoner in Riyadh. So you have an intervention in the Yemen in the name of support for Hadi, the president of Yemen. And one of the key parties to that intervention is actively undermining him and splitting the country. Not in two. I think Yemen is actually being split tribally as well. It really is disintegrating as a state. It's stopped being a state. It stopped being one place a number of years ago. So I'm trying to think, in answering your question, of a Saudi policy or even an Emirati policy that has actually gone right. The Yemen campaign was supposed to be a quick campaign, a blitzkrieg, and the first thing that Mohammed bin Salman did was go off on holidays to the Maldives. And not even the then American Secretary for Defense could contact him for a few weeks. I'm trying to think of whether his austerity campaign, which he's now reversed, has gone right. I'm very interested to see how quickly or not this new golden city of Neom is going to be built. You know, it's absolutely, his policies are full of grand declarations, lots of PR, lots of money. But what's actually happening on the ground? Well, actually happening on the ground for most the Saudis are not a rich country, and yet you have a ruler that can spend upwards of or up to $500 billion on American arms. Does that go down well with the average Saudi? The average Qatari is much, much richer. There is an inherent instability in these very quickly rolled out policies which don't have a genesis as a policy, whether it's good or bad. It just simply doesn't have a genesis that we would call rational. Yes, there are rational motives for it, but there isn't the input of policy making. There aren't documents. There isn't a process. It is, let's do it and let's do it now. And this creates absolute chaos around the region and will continue to do so. I think one of the problems of the Arab Spring, going back to the original question, is that the people who were in one place and the money was in another. In fact, most of the money was actually in London. In the London property market. And that's a fundamental problem with the Arab Spring. In fact, the Middle East has the capacity to fund its own democratic development. But it is absolutely unable to do so. The place where Saudi Arabia should really be investing in is Egypt. And the statistics, the economic statistics, we haven't got an economist on the panel, and I'm certainly not an economist, is very, very important. And I think the economic bottom line of Egypt is getting worse and worse as Sisi stumbles into a a new era. Why is he still in place? Why is, again, back to Saudi foreign policy? Very, very interesting to actually analyze this. You had, for instance, a proper rival in Ahmed Shafiq. Shafiq was housed in Abu Dhabi and was given all sorts of indications that he'd be favored by the Emiratis, who are fed up, and also the Saudis as well, of paying. Sisi's expensive, and they're fed up with paying for him. So they were giving all sorts of indications to Shafiq to run against him, and in fact allowing a very interesting set of visitors to Abu Dhabi, including from the army, including from the cops, and it stopped when Sisi got on the phone to bin Zayed and said, "Do you realize that your man is just about to attend a conference in Paris with most of the Egyptian opposition? Stop it." And he did. And bin Zayed delivered Ahmed Shafiq on a plate to Sisi, and Sisi has had him either under house arrest or nullified ever since. Why did the Emiratis abandon Shafiq, who would not have been against the Emirates? He would have been a more moderating influence, as indeed Sami Anan would have been. Why did they push him and then abandon it? And I think the reason behind that is because Sisi in power is too important for a plan that is currently being hatched to trade, normalize relations with Israel, and to set up a group of dictators who regionally will replace the Arab League and create an international system, an international Arab system which would entrench a dictatorship, basically. And they're thinking big, and they're thinking long term, and they're thinking about their relations with Washington and also their relationship with Israel. There's a desperate attempt, and there are already the signs of quite big deals, particularly in the gas field, in which Saudi Arabia would start trading with Israel. So it's a big scheme. It is designed to replace America and American hegemony. It's long term. They're thinking big. They're thinking about the next 100 years or the next 50 years. And that's why Sisi is still there, because he's one element of a jigsaw, all arranged between a very small group of people. I mean, it sounds like conspiracy theory, but I actually think there's quite a lot of evidence for it.
David mentioned, talked about the Saudi and Emirati support propping up President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, but do you see the support as being, do you see the Emiratis and Saudis as being equal partners with Egypt, or is it more of a sponsor-sponsee type of relationship?
Well, I think David already mentioned a little bit about that. It's not.
President Sisi has refused to be a Gulf pawn.
It's
Why
not
would they
a
still
sponsor-sponsee. I can say they are sponsors, but not necessarily he's a sponsee. Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and Emirates in particular, have actually financed the coup d'etat in Egypt. There is no doubt about that. They paid Sisi himself, and they told him, you overthrow the government, we will give you so much money that you will overnight become a hero to Egyptians, which they did. They gave unbelievable amounts of money. We talk about tens of billions of dollars that were poured in immediately after Sisi overthrew the first and so far the only democratically elected president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi. Tens of billions initially, and they kept on giving, and they keep on giving. So they assume, like anybody would, if I give so much money, you have to listen to me. I mean, it's natural. But I think they miscalculated there. They are still having the upper hand because they still have more money, but not necessarily that Egypt behaves like a sponsee. Yes, there is give and take, but Egypt has their own policy on many issues. And Sisi feels that he still has fantastic backing, not only from Israel, which he certainly has, from European countries, from US, and that he is far too bigger and more important than these others. So situation between them is so far going into Egypt's favor. Not that Sisi has done anything with that money, let's make it clear. Egypt is, like David said, in a terrible economic shape. Even after so many tens of billions being poured in, they had to resort to IMF and other things, and they are cooking their accounting books to show that they have more reserves than what they actually do have. Egypt is it's rapidly looking like a failed state, which is nothing new to Egypt. They have been looking like a failed state before. I think Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a phenomenon that is nothing new to Egypt. He's a military man. So was Mubarak and Sadat. Everybody there was a military man. This is normal. I think it's impossible for him to keep on, even with so much money coming from Emirates and Egypt, to carry on. Now, I want to just address maybe a few other things that were mentioned here. Of course, Kamal said there is no black and white. I think we know there is no black and white, but that there are some people that represent evil. It is true. That doesn't mean that the other side is good. So in case of Syria, Assad is evil. He says many people have not been. I've been to Syria many times. I worked, I'm not proud of, with Syrian government even. They are evil people. Assad is evil. And so was Mubarak. And so were many others. And some were overthrown, some were not. History will take its course. I think the Middle East will forget people like Sisi and like Assad's family and others over time to come. David in the beginning has been talking about revolutions that take longer time. Of course, this revolution is going to take a long time. They thought, and the whole world made them believe, that things will change overnight. This did not happen. It's not realistic. South America has had also generals ruling every single country, and they have been overthrown 30, 40 years ago, but still these democracies are struggling. They're improving. Middle East, including Egypt, with all these things, they are trying to bring back the tourist numbers and investments. It's not really working. Still, the tourist numbers are half of what they were, say, 2013 or 14 when the revolutions were happening, or 2012 and 13. I think Sisi was an example that Emiratis and Saudis used, like they did with Yemen and with some other, like General Haftar in Libya. I mean, they created chaos in Libya, for example. Libya was more or less functioning. Emiratis funded as much as they funded the coup in Egypt. They funded the chaos in Libya. They are still funding it. How long they can keep on doing it, I don't know. They seem very arrogant. They feel that they control the centers of power through this vast money that David said they have been throwing. These are unbelievable amounts. I mean, with that money, they could have revitalized one continent. They keep on throwing this money in corrupt way, buying politicians, think tanks, journalists, everybody that matters, anywhere where they want. Again, I think they overestimated their reach. They do have vast reserves, but they are rapidly draining them. There is no proper accounting, so we don't know actually how much money they do have. Like now we can see in Saudi Arabia that this so-called great reformer king wants to bring economic benefits to Saudi Arabia, and his main trump card, is the Saudi Aramco listing. And he blew a figure that Saudi Aramco is worth 2,000 billions, $2 trillion. 2 trillions? That would mean that profit of Saudi Aramco would have to be at least 150 billion per year. It's impossible. There is no way. No company makes that much money profit, especially no company that's run without transparency, without proper management. We don't know the figures of Saudi Aramco. So as I said, we don't really know how much money they have. They keep on throwing that money in financing all these counter-revolutions and bribing the politicians. How long they can keep on doing it, I don't know. But what I'm certain, it can be next year or it can be in 10, 15, 20 years. These revolutions, they will take back their course. They will take it back from these dictators, autocrats, etc. So Abdel Fattah Sisi will go down the drain of history, hopefully in a very bad way, like some of the predecessors.
Ahmed, would you say that, is it fair to say that the number of countries that now qualify as failing states, Egypt, Libya, Yemen and Iraq, is this a product of the Arab Spring, or were failing states the rationale and the motives behind popular uprisings?
It can go both ways, but you see, failed states obviously provoked the uprising. But you see, to start with, I think it's fair to blame dysfunctional states today on somebody who has ruled it for 40 years without allowing any even semblance of civil political life and anything. So how do you expect people in a country where for 40 plus years they had no chance to run anything, how do you expect them to find their way out in such a chaotic times? Difficult. So I think it's reasonable to blame, for instance, a lot of what's happening in Libya on Qaddafi for next few decades. But it's not just that. I think failed states are intentionally being created because the way dictatorships justify, legitimize themselves, or try to legitimize themselves, is exactly by projecting the image of themselves as a lesser of two evils. I mean, there is no way you can expect that the world accepts you with all your transgressions and infringements of human rights and everything. So your best option, or the only option, is to say, maybe we are bad, but you know, if you want to avoid other calamities like uncontrolled migrations, you know, tribal civil wars, and the worst, Muslim terrorism, you better have us. So this is exactly what they are up to. And they have making sure this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, they're making sure there is always this threat around so that they, with all their mischiefs, look like lesser of two evils. You know, look at ISIS. In 2011 and 12, when the uprising was mostly non-violent still, I mean, the extremist voices disappeared, basically. Only, and of course, there was a lot of pressure on the Syrian regime because it really looked bad. Once the ISIS emerged, you know, I think Syrian regime was very happy. It could now claim that, you know, compared to ISIS, they looked like more acceptable option. And that's eventually what happened. Everyone, de facto, sided by the Syrian regime fighting the ISIS. So unfortunately, in the region, it very often, for many of those centers of power, it boils down to the worse, the better. The only thing that is not an option is to lose power. Everything is else. Else is. We can bomb churches. We can bomb our own people. We can use chemicals against them. We can do anything. The only thing that we cannot do, we cannot allow to lose power, unfortunately.
Ghalib, Turkey, but also Saudi Arabia and to a certain extent Egypt, traditional U.S. allies, have now been either estranged or less trusting of U.S. policies in the region. Would you blame Washington alone for that? Perhaps President Barack Obama in his second term, or someone else?
Well, I mean, Washington is an interesting player in the region. But no, I will not blame Washington alone because the reason that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt has become, the nature of the relation between them has become acrimonious is very much related to the, what has happened in the last 7-8 years in the Arab world. And because both these countries represented different poles, different vision for the countries. I mean, the reason that Turkey and Egypt, for instance, today is having a very tense relations, well, I mean, the tension is decreasing, is what has happened with the coup. Because Turkey did things, if the Arab Spring succeeded, we would have seen a new regional order emerging. Because for a new regional order to emerge, you need to have countries, and like-minded countries, when it comes to some political values, some, geopolitical priorities, at least some, some like-minded countries to exist. And when you don't have it, then you have the picture that you have today. So in this regard, it is very much related to what is happening in the region, across the region. But the trouble with US is the following. I think the year 2013 is the crucial year when we analyze the Arab uprisings. Because two things happened which I think changed the course of the Arab uprising. The coup in Egypt, and Assad used chemical weapon. It was a red line, and the Washington did not do anything. Whoever tells us that Assad did not lose power because of his social base or tribal support is completely wrong. Syrian crisis at this stage is a regional and a global power play. And that's why when you discuss about Astana, it's not Syrian government there. Astana is Russia, Turkey, Iran. When you discuss Geneva, who discuss very much actually how big a power player is he? If the US government tomorrow decides in a significant way to topple Assad, what would his fate would be? In Libya, what led to the downfall of Qaddafi? Was it Libyan people? Yes, Libyan people was part of the story, but effectively it was NATO. I mean, Libyan people was part of the story, but effectively it was NATO. The recent image in which the picture that showed Assad and Putin in Hmeimim base, in which Assad was shown his place in relation to Putin, behave treated as if he is just one of the stuff out of Putin. That tells us about the power play in Syria. This is the real picture in Syria. Because if Assad is so popular, then the question, why don't we see public discontent in the US-dominated area, which is 22% of the Syria, public discontent, framing this as an occupation of US and asking for the Assad regime to return to these areas. So in this regard, one of the major mistake that we make when we analyze Syria, opposition is important, Assad is important, but unfortunately what has changed the fate of the Syria was the regional and international power play. Not what Assad has been doing, not what opposition at this stage is doing. They're important, I don't deny their importance, but it's a regional and international power play that is and still there is no reality on the ground. The only reality that I see in Syria but across the region is the region doesn't have a reality on the ground now. The only reality is that the region doesn't have a reality. And the regimes and the political establishment in the region does have a character. That doesn't mean we have to go into a very black and white structures, but all the regimes in the region has a character. Saddam did have a deputy as a Kurd. His deputy. But is the same Saddam that engaged in a genocidal campaign against the Kurds? Saddam had a Christian foreign minister, Tariq Aziz. Yeah. But does this tell us a very significant story about it? Saddam had some senior Shia figures, but wasn't he Saddam that engaged in a genocidal campaign against the Shia population in the regions? And Soviet Union had, the head of the intelligence as Azeri, or it had this Mongolian as the head of. But isn't Soviet Union essentially the core of it was Russians? Wasn't the core of Ottoman Empire with regards to Turkey? So the regime in the regions, yes, it's not a black white. There is many different pictures, but there is a core reason why we say that the opposition is mainly Sunni. Even opposition has some, they had the Christian presence. The chairman, George Sabra, was Christian. Abdul Basit Sida was Kurd, who was the chairman of the opposition. But doesn't opposition has a very clear image of being Sunni Arab dominated? Yeah. It does. So in this regard, in the region, any analysis that at this stage that analyzes Syria based on the Assad capacity and opposition capacity is completely missing the picture. Opposition is losing the ground. But to whom they are losing the ground? To whom they are losing the ground? Right now, effectively, Turkey is creating, if Turkey, right now from the Euphrates Hills area to Idlib, if it creates this corridor, like 10 to 15% of the Syrian population will effectively come somehow within the influence zones of Turkey. So I'm not sure, any analysis of us that Assad as the, Assad regime as one of the primary unit of analysis, as the main actor, I think misses the big picture. It is in Syria, the fact that Hezbollah is on the ground, Iran is on the ground, Russia is on the ground, Turkey is on the ground, US is on the ground, tells us a story. Yeah. And this is the major actors that very much defines the nature of the war in Syria. Yeah. And I don't deny that there is a significance of opposition, YPG regime. They are important players, but the most decisive player is the regional and international players.
Now allow me to bring in Kamal. Kamal, is the myriad of alliances today in Syria beginning to look less like non-state actors, but more like middle power rivalries between Iran, Saudi Arabia, US, Russia, and perhaps Turkey?
So no, absolutely, and I actually agree with Mr. Ghalib. It's an international regional war, and this is why I said in the beginning, Assad or the Syrians have very little to do with it. Of course, he's the figurehead, the president, so because your question started off with Assad, and that's how I answered it. But it's an international war. There's very little Syrians have to do with it, unfortunately, apart from dying and paying for it themselves. But there are other factors involved. The Russian military, as Mr. Ghalib said, they're the ones that turned around the war. Not actually the Iranians, the Russians. Similarly, the end game, I think the Turkish, Iranian, Russian de-escalation zone, if anything can end the war, it's these three countries cooperating together. I think West has very little left to do in Syria. They at least have no good options. So whatever happens, whether it's in the north with Afrin and the Kurdish areas, whether it's even with Ghouta, you have the Russian military police there, because a lot of the Syrian fighters from the opposition side say we won't trust the Syrian military, and so you bring in the Russian military police. You have the Egyptians now in Ghouta as well. You have at least 40 Egyptians there as negotiators. So it's a very international war. As I mentioned, China is a big player in Syria now, so are the BRICS countries. It is a middle power rivalry. We look at a rivalry between even Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Now you have the Qatari Prime Minister who gave an interview a year or so ago saying, criticizing the Saudis. The Saudis are criticizing the Qataris. So it's like, it's all a blame game between regional powers. Turkey, of course, does not trust America. So you have NATO members not trusting each other when it comes to Syria. There's very little the Syrian government or Assad can do about the war. It's completely out of their control. And again, I agree with Ghalib there that if the Americans had decided, they could have, but the Russians put their foot down. The head of the Russian army said 2 days ago, if the American planes try to attack Damascus, we'll shoot them down. It's a big statement. One has to question why the Russians, of course, are there. They have their own motives, but we see Russia rising in the Middle East again. This is the first Saudi king that's ever visited Moscow. No Saudi king visited before. The Qataris are buying weapons from the Russians. The Egyptians, after 25 years of not being that close to the Russian military, again, our Sisi is going. So I think Russians have played their hand extremely well. Whether it's good or bad, I'm not saying. I'm just saying the way they've done it is very, very strategic. Again, they've taken quite a few of their Muslim officers, right? I'm no expert on Islam in Russia, but I do know that you see a lot of Russian Muslim military police and Russian soldiers. You have Chechen president, the Chechen Federation. So there are a lot of things happening. And again, as I say, it definitely is a middle power rivalry. Syria cannot end this war. Even if President Assad goes tomorrow, it's not going to end the war. Things are going to carry on. And again, one must read the analysis. It's not a lot of these states are authoritarian because there's groups of authorities, not one man. So it's more like Algeria and the Egyptian army, where it doesn't matter. Sisi can go tomorrow, another general will come. In fact, I'm pretty sure Sisi will not be here for the whole 4 years. The Egyptian military are already planning who the next general. So that's a system. Similarly with Algeria, Bouteflika is just a figurehead. Same with in Syria, again, there's a lot of friction between, like the Syrian military don't like the Iranians. So why have the Russians come in and support the Syrian military? So they want the Syrian military to be the way they were pre-war. And in that sense, it's the state that matters more than one man. And I think the obsession of one man, you know, good, bad, yes, bad, but don't put the pressure on just one man, because what that does is it becomes an obsession, you know. And it's like Saddam, right? The West loved Saddam. Germans and the British were selling him chemical weapons to gas the Kurds. They were okay with that. When Saddam was launching gas attacks on Iran, the West was happy with that, right? So, and then Saddam became the enemy, and now you can say Saddam used the gas. Well, who sold him the gas? Who asked Iraq to attack Iran? So Iran wasn't the aggressor in the Iraq-Iran war, at least. So I think it's a very fickle world we live in. Qaddafi was then seen as a hero. People were hugging him. You know, MI6 were torturing people with the help of Qaddafi. Rendition flights, the MI6 and CIA were working with the Syrian intelligence and said, you guys torture well, torture. So now you can say, well, Assad tortures. Okay, great. 5 years ago, you were like, okay, you should torture for us. The new head of the CIA, that woman has been done for war crimes in Germany because she was overseeing a black site in Thailand. So even when it comes to torture, let's not kid ourselves and choose when we want these leaders to torture for us, when we don't want them to torture for us. So I think that is one of the situations, that this is why, because of the hypocrisy, because all these slogans are empty, that's why this is happening. And it's definitely an international war, very similar to 100 years ago when you had, you know, Lawrence of Arabia walking into Damascus. You know, most of the Syrians didn't like him at all, or the Hashemites. We of course know, you know, the great Fakhruddin Pasha, who was fighting in Medina, and we all know who was opposing him. So I think there are a lot of these things which there's more than meets the eye, and we should remove emotion. Of course, it's hard to remove emotion because it's a very bloody war. Civilians are paying a price, but there is an interesting mosaic there. And I think at the end of the day, the de-escalation zones, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, for good or for bad, will decide the end of this war, not the West, not the Syrians.
David, again, moving back to the Gulf, exactly how much leverage do the Emiratis have over the Saudis today? Would you say that the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, and the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, have a mentor-mentee type of relationship whereby the older MBZ views MBS as someone who needs to be tutored?
Well, definitely, as I said before, the brains behind what a 32-year-old prince is now trying to do is definitely Mohammed bin Zayed, both in respect of what's going on around Qatar, but also in respect of Trump. We haven't actually talked about Trump much, but he is a factor in all of this. He provides chaos. And chaos in this sense is quite helpful. I regard America mainly at war with itself at the moment, and there has been a very series of choreographed moves, one of which happened just a day or so ago when Tillerson was removed without his knowledge, almost by a tweet. Tillerson ended up by being a brake on Trump's policies, and in particular the policy that is being hatched up with the Emiratis and with MBS. Personally, the role that bin Zayed played was, one, he was the brains behind the plan to put Mohammed bin Salman in power and really make him a king by taking out rivals like bin Naif, who at the time was a Washington favorite and a counter.
Security man.
Yeah. He achieved that. The second one was the introduction to the Trump family. The third one was the introduction through the Trump family to Israel and a back channel there. And so he's been part of, thirdly, a flow of funds as well has taken place. So he's an absolutely instrumental figure. When bin Salman comes king, I'm waiting for the moment that there's a ruction between the two. Because I think that is also in the nature of the relationship. If you look at the history of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they've had plenty of disputes. And I don't see that relationship necessarily lasting. But at the moment, you're right. One is the mentor of the other. One is like sort of the Prince Regent. I think this will fall apart because I think, although they've got the money, they've got the plan, they've got the military strength, that group that I'm talking about. What they don't have is any buy-in by the majority of people who live in the Middle East, either their own populations or the Palestinians. Again, we haven't talked about the plan for Palestine, but it is very, very much bears the hallmarks of the same thinking. It's top down. You replace the leadership if it doesn't do what you want it to do. And you take key elements off the table. You take East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state off the table. You take the Jordan Valley off the table. You take the right of return off the table. One thing after another. I don't know of a single Palestinian leader who can accept the loss of even a nominal right of return. But that's the plan. That's the so-called deal of the century. And then you negotiate the rest. And it's obviously going to fail. Again, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Hashemites. Again, it was put to me by I did an interview with a very well-known Jordanian foreign minister and diplomat, and he basically said to me, this is Marwan Mouasha, who was the first Jordanian ambassador to Israel. He basically said about the Saudis, they say, you're either with them, you're either with me totally or against me. You can't be partially with me or partially not. That's the view of statesmanship, as they put it. Now, Jordan went along partly with the blockade of Qatar in the sense that it closed down the Al Jazeera office, but didn't close down Al Jazeera. It closed down the office. It's a very Jordanian thing to do. It partially went along with it. They partially went along with Iran, although not wholly. But that was not enough for Saudi Arabia because they have a completely zero-sum game analysis to foreign relations. So it's not going to work. A lot of these policies have got the seeds of their own destruction.
Edhem, how is it that distinguished American journalists like Thomas Frieden from the New York Times or David Ignatius from the Washington Post portray both Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed as much needed reformists in the Middle East? Exactly how much money is being spent on buying American journalists?
We should check their accounts, but it's obviously money. As I mentioned earlier, and everybody mentioned, these people have money, they throw money. So I say often, they tell a journalist, look, we want you to write this. No, what do you think? I have my credibility. Okay, here's $1 million. No, are you crazy? I am so respected. $5 million. No, 10 million. Okay, what do you want me to write? So this is what they do. They buy anybody. I mean, people are willing to be sold. They think, look, I've done my part. I've been good. Now I'll take some money. I can plan retirement. And the Emiratis are willing to pay. So they are portraying Mohammed ibn Salman is the great reformer, as I said earlier, so-called. I don't know he's reforming what. I mean, it's a nonsense what he's doing in Saudi Arabia. And his mentor, Mohammed ibn Zayed, is obviously a far smarter guy compared to the mentee. He has been very actively trying to mess around everywhere. He has messed around Turkish elections. He has messed around Turkish referendum. He has messed around everywhere. He created, as I said, chaos in Libya. He installed the government in Egypt, and he created war in Yemen. I have a colleague sitting here, somewhere at the back, who maybe 5 or 6 months before the war in Yemen came to my office and told me, look, there is a Twitter account from an insider of Emirati palace who said they had a meeting and who was present in the meeting, and they will stir up the trouble in Yemen. Why? Because at that time, Yemen post-Arab Spring was ruled by Islah. Not really ruled, but majority party in the parliament was Islah party that is allied with Muslim Brotherhood. And because Emiratis have this inexplicable hatred towards Muslim Brotherhood, they wanted to have them removed. By all means, Yemen was functioning at the time. So he told me they will create a chaos by paying Houthis to start the trouble, and then the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who still had a lot of forces with him, will also interfere and, to make it peaceful. The only reason is let's kick Islah out of the equation. I told him, that friend who is sitting behind, said this is nonsense. I want to use another word, but it's not proper. This is nonsense. There is no way. Yemen is functioning. I met some of these parliamentarians recently. Everything is doing well. He said, look, this is what they say that was hatched by Mohammed ibn Zayed and his advisors and this close circle of people. 5, 6 months down the line, then suddenly this Houthi started having some nonsensical demands from the government, and the trouble started out of the blue. And I said, look, this is true. Until now, I'm very firmly convinced the Yemen war was caused and started by United Arab Emirates. And of course, they have now controlled the southern part, their militias and militaries and their mercenaries that Emiratis are paying. An American company, very famous for the torture that they have been doing in Iraq, Blackwater. That company has been kicked out of the United States. And now it's based in Abu Dhabi. They changed the name to Academia or something. And their fighters and their torturers and their mercenaries are in Yemen. Of course, they are in eastern Libya. In eastern Libya. They are in Saudi Arabia. When it comes to torturing their own people, it's probably not proper for some Saudi boys to do it. So let's send you some American-trained, Emirati-owned torturers.
Ahmed, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman recently met in Cairo with Dr. Ahmed Al-Taib, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, who is an open supporter of President Sisi. How have Islamic scholars, the ulama and Islamic intellectuals reacted to the Arab Spring uprising? Did they support the state or the people?
Oh, thank you for that question. I think this is one of the overlooked sides or aspects of the whole phenomenon of the Arab Spring. And I mean, given my background, I think it's very worrying, and at the social level, I think it is very worrying, both how Muslim Islamic scholars, ulama, have reacted, and how generally secular intellectuals, liberal intellectuals have reacted to the developments. And I think it's been overwhelmingly huge disappointment, and it's, I think, just another symptom of how deep the crisis of the Arab world is, and how long is the reform agenda that awaits any future government in the region. Unfortunately, most of ulama, as we know, are not independent in the Arab world. They are appointed or paid by the governments. And one should have probably not even expected that they have their own opinion and their own position. They have simply justified what the governments have been doing. And that often meant justifying bloodbath, massacres, torture, and everything else. Now, my concern here is that, of course, who cares about ulama after all? But the problem is that the ultimate victim of this is Islam itself. And I would say is hope. So I think the biggest victim, the biggest casualty of all these chaos are Islam and the hope. Why? Because we often blame extremists for abusing Islam, forgetting actually that Islam is abused by governments, by scholars, by opposition sometimes, by international governments, literally by everyone. Now, what is the long-term impact of this multiple abuse? You have now a new phenomenon, especially in Iraq, Lebanon, and Egypt, that young people don't want to hear anything from ulama or anything about Islam itself, because people cannot anymore distinguish between the idea and those who speak in the name of the idea. And they have seen scholars justifying massacres. They have seen scholars justifying authoritarian rulers of the worst kind. And I think this is one problem. The other problem, unfortunately, is that, you know, we often say, why so much Islam? Why only Islam all the time? And why not something else? Unfortunately, this was an opportunity that was missed by liberal intellectuals to re-establish the credibility of liberalism in the Arab world, in the eyes of Arab citizens. And they failed again, because they did the same. You know, liberal intellectuals, unfortunately, don't have sabr, don't have the patience to argue their case, to build their case. They are blinded by their hate their disgust, actually, for Islamists, and their desire to get to power as soon as possible. In the end, they jump on the first tank that shows up in the streets, and they lose any credibility. So, see, there have been, what to do about it? I think there have been proposals that Arab societies should be, and political systems should be secularized. I don't think it's very realistic. Probably less unrealistic proposal would be to try to give some autonomy, if not independence, to Islamic institutions, the way we try to give it to judiciary and legislator vis-a-vis executive. Because I think Islamic institutions, Islamic structures in the Muslim societies, in the Arab societies especially, are going to be around for a while. I don't think it's realistic to expect those societies to get secularized thoroughly, but at least we should hope and aspire for some sort of autonomy, hoping to create another center of power and an alternative.
Right. Well, Kemal, The Guardian's Martin Chulov recently wrote an article about an existing Iranian land corridor from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea. To what extent are Iranians able to exercise their political and military influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen? Or is it more of a myth?
I think it's a reality in terms of Iranian presence in the region. Let's not forget, the Persians invented chess, and they're playing chess and winning the game, you know, all the way. No matter how much money the Gulf Arabs might have, they can't outwit Persian strategy. You know, Saudis buy the most expensive weapons in the world, and they can't even fly the planes correctly. So whilst, you know, Iran, with very little real military might, have their proxies all over the region, not just that, Afghanistan. Yeah. NATO had 150,000 troops in Afghanistan, and 3 NATO generals in Kabul, their interpreter and chief of staff was an Iranian spy. You know? So it goes to show you that Iran have their strategy. They're all over the region, not just in the Arab world, but in the non-Arab world as well. They're present, they're fighting. There was a Newsweek cover, I think 2 years ago, with Qasem Soleimani saying first he defeated America, now he's fighting ISIS. So they themselves have built, the Americans have built this myth about Iranians, you know. But again, if you look at Iraq and the Iraq invasion, the Iranians actually helped the Americans come into Iraq. Even in Afghanistan, when September 11th happened, all the leaders of Afghanistan were brought in by Iran. So you had the Bonn conference, and actually Khatami was there. The Americans told Khatami, look, if you help us get rid of the Taliban and put in the Northern Alliance, we can then work with you. And all this is there. Same with Iraq. Iran helped remove Saddam. They were working with the Americans, and of course the Axis of Evil speech came and things turned. So I think given the history of Iran's encirclement, they feel it's their time now. They were gassed by the Iraqis, helped by the West, helped by the Saudis. So the Iranians are like, okay. So there was a very interesting press conference by Javed Zarif, I think last year, you can watch it. And he's been asked about the weapons. And Javed Zarif said, which country was faced with most of the gas attacks that the Iraqis were doing? It was Iran. And who was supporting them? Now that doesn't justify Iranian interference, but let's be honest, everyone is interfering everywhere. Whether it's Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Turkey, there's not a single big actor in the region which is not interfering in someone else's business. So the land corridor is there. I think, as I said, as far as the Iranians are concerned, they can smile and say, okay, do what you can about it. Don't cry about it, fight us. That is the feeling. Of course, Yemen has backfired, as we all know, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. So that hasn't worked. Iraq hasn't worked, of course. Everyone knows who the biggest player in Iraq is. Lebanon as well. For all the accusations against Hezbollah and etc. Iranians were pretty clever. They got Mishaal Aoun, the former head of the Lebanese army, and very interesting that because Mishaal Aoun had to flee on a French helicopter and the Syrian army was going to kill him. This was in the 90s. Now Mishaal Aoun has become an ally of the Syrians. Again goes back to Syria. No matter what you say, the Syrian intelligence still have massive control with the Iranians. So there is that interesting relationship that Iran has with multiple actors, even Turkey. Turkey and Iran's bilateral economic relations are extremely important and good, despite the two countries having opposing views on Iraq and Syria. So I think, Iran is there. It's not going to be easy to roll them back. And how will, at the moment you've got Trump and Netanyahu who want war against Iran. Of course, the Saudis want war against Iran. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops because at the moment, all the rhetoric against Iran is there because they are present. But how will they actually remove Iran? I don't think anyone really knows because Iranians are far ahead.
Galip, does Turkey see Iranian moves in Syria and Iraq as a threat to its interests since these actions bring Iranian proxies closer to the Turkish border? Despite having very close economic relations, we know that the head of the Iranian military visited Ankara last year. The Turkish chief of staff, Hulusi Akar, visited Tehran, the first time since the Iranian Revolution.
Well, in the end, there is some very general pattern to Turkish-Iranian relations. This relation has always been tense, but has always been compartmentalized, and there has always been a level of working relationship as well too. The last war between Turkey and Iran, it was in 1821 to 1823, and the Turkish-Iranian border was set in 1639. So in this regard, there is, both of them, when you compare to the rest of the regions, has a consolidated state structure, has some kind of maturity to compartmentalize the relations. So you can have a bad political relations, but at the same time have a functioning economic tourism relations as well too. So this is one of the picture. But then there has been also a very decided pattern, which is, all the time, both countries has always been wary of each other's gains, because both countries are, within the region. They used to be major imperial powers. Now they're post-imperial nation states, still neighboring each other with a multi-regional ambitions. It's not only in the Middle East that both countries has ambitions in Central Asia, in Caucasus, even in Afghanistan, in Gulf, etc. And in all of them, there is some kind of strategic incompatibility between Iran and Turkey. And it's actually a bit funny because both there is strategic incompatibility between Turkey and Russia as well too, Turkey and Iran. Now it's the countries that has that much strategic incompatibility. They found a way to work on Syria in a limited manner. But Also, right now, the nature of the competition has very much to do, once again, with how the regional context has evolved. Because what I will say, Iran is, of all the actors in the region, is the one that is best situated to operate within a chaotic context. Because this is the context that it has known for years. It faced sanctions, it's a post-revolutionary countries, it creates a parallel security structure, not outside of the country. It has that parallel security structure within the country as well too. So it knows very well how to create militias. Bad organization of Iraq was created in 1982, Hezbollah was created in 1982, etc., etc. So when the regional context became really chaotic, became driven by civil wars, Iran already had and know-how and infrastructure in place. It had militia armies in Iraq, in Lebanon, creating one in Syria as well too. So it did have the know-how of the context, and it could much better navigate it. But when the time was, like think of 2010, 9/11, and at the early stage of the Arab Spring, there was like, I used to be, when we were talking like particularly in major Western think tanks, etc., there used to be a major judgment which used to say, well, Turkey is the absolute winner of the Arab Spring and Iran is the absolute loser. In 2011, if you have been to a conference on the Arab uprising, this is what you would have gotten. Turkey is the winner, Iran is the loser. And that tells me about the nature of the two countries. Because Turkey, to some extent, applied what it learned from its engagement with the European Union to rest of the Arab world. What was Turkey discussing in 2010, 9, 11? Well, free visa travel. With Sham, there was this very anecdote in which, as a reference to the Schengen, Turkey says well, we'll create Schengen between Turkey and Syria. Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon was talking about a free trade area. So in a sense, the know-how that Turkey has, because it is the most industrialized country in the region as well, to put aside Israel, the know-how that Turkey has required a stable regional context for it to flourish, because it needs to do business. It needs to create a much more tourism times, because it's attract tourists. So when the context becomes a civil war driven, it did not have the natural places in. It did not have the natural know-how or infrastructure in place. And now in the region, contrary to the conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom will tell us, well, after a while, non-state actors will be integrated into state structure. This is not what is happening in the region. In the region, I said state is being integrated into the structure of the non-state actors. Look at Iraq, the recent law. You have a state which allocates 40% of its defense spending to non-state actors called Hashishabi. And what is the political loyalty structure of the Hashishabi? Well, some of them is to Iraq, but the major one is to Walayat al-Faqih, to Iran. So it is, if you think just with the logic of nation-state context, it's unthinkable. And this is what concerns Turkey. So Turkey has two pictures of Iran. One, Iran, it's in its immediate neighborhood, which is Levant and Iraq. One, Iran is a broader region. When Turkey look at the Iran in its immediate neighborhood, it's very much concerned with now what I call the militia belt running from Iran all the way to Mediterranean. This creates a strategic handicap for Turkey. No time in the recent centuries that places from Tehran, Basra, Baghdad, Kirkuk, Mosul, Aleppo to Beirut, this line is very much coming under the influence of one party. So this creates a strategic challenge. But when Turkey look at Iran in the broader region, it does not regard its relation with Iran just in bilateral terms. It also regards what is happening. Then it sees another contest, which is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, etc. And there, Turkey is not willing to problematize Iran as much as the others do, because Turkey is as much concerned about the Iran's power projection in its immediate neighborhood as it is concerned about the authoritarian quarters, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, Israel, and Trump administration, what they want to do in the broader region, because it sees as Iran-centric regional or as Iran-centric Levant order in something that is very much disturbing Turkey, but this Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Bahrain-centric broader regional order is as much of something that is rejected by Turkey.
Right. David, the big difference between 2011 and today is that in addition to all the wars and failed states in the Middle East, there's now a full-blown crisis of liberal democracy in Europe and in the United States. How has this influenced and licensed the behavior of this new generation of Middle Eastern dictators? We have to be brief.
Okay, well, there is a crisis going on. It's expressed in different countries differently. It is certainly expressed in Britain by Brexit. It's expressed by basically white nationalism in America. America is a very polarized place. It's not just the White House fighting what we'd call the deep state, the CIA or the State Department. It's also different portions of the population which are basically fighting identity wars. Exactly the same thing is happening in Britain, and the same thing also is happening to France, where there's a huge rise of anti-Islam sentiment, which is very crudely expressed. Islamism in France is regarded as a challenge and an enemy of the French concept of laïcité, which itself has been weaponized. Was originally in 1906 a liberal notion to push back the power of the Catholic Church. It's now become weaponized by the right in France, which is not going away, even with Macron. So you have a whole series of identity conflicts going on. I think that liberal democracy is partly to blame. I think a lot of what happened, I was a correspondent in Russia, I saw what the Clinton administration was trying to do with Russia, very, very similar to the mistakes that Bush made with Iraq. It was basically trying to reform a country in its own image with very little knowledge of the forces at work. And without being arrogant, one of the things I did right as a correspondent for The Guardian then in Moscow was to predict not Putin, but the rise of Russian nationalism. That's very, very much a consequence of the expectations of capitalism in a country which had absolutely no experience of it. So I think these are very big forces that have been unleashed in the West, and I think there'll be turbulence for a long time to come. As for the relationship between political turbulence in Western Europe and in America, and a very small, powerful, but isolated group of people that we've been talking about for the last hour, I think there's a direct relationship. I think money changed hands, and I think more details will come out about the funding of the Trump campaign. Didn't just come necessarily from Russia. I think it came from other sources as well. That's an ongoing investigation, but also personal contacts. And in fact, what we've had in this period is the Middle Eastization of the West, to use a very clumsy phrase. And one of the attractions of, for instance, the Saudi prince to someone like Jared Kushner is that he too is a member of the Trump family. It's one family dealing with another. It's nothing to do with ability or training or anything that we would say here now as a formation in foreign policy. They didn't go to Chatham House, they didn't go to any elite schools. They're all trained locally, and they sort of wallow in each other's ignorance and appreciate it, and appreciate the family connections. So there is a degradation of foreign policy capacity that has happened in America with either seasoned diplomats leaving or being cut out of the loop. Tillerson, who was not a diplomat but an oilman with global realism, was himself cut out of the loop. He famously described Trump as a moron. And I think this process is here to stay, alas. I think it's a very, very turbulent period that we're in. But it's not just a crisis of the Middle East that we're dealing with. We really are dealing with a political crisis of Western liberal democracy.
Right. Edhem, very briefly, since we'll have to end our live transmission soon, how would you assess Doha's handling of the blockade? It has been going on since June last year, and has this turned into a lobbying war in Washington, D.C. between the Emirates, Saudi Arabia against Doha?
Sure. I mean, it's great for the United States. Everybody's spending money there to try to buy favors. Of course, much more money has been spent by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but now Qatar is in the game as well. I think the blockade was very ambitious. Emiratis, Saudis thought they are going to finish Qatar off. Eventually, maybe even either change the rulers in Qatar through some local maneuvering or invade Qatar by their forces. Qatar prevented this by having a large American base and by strengthening the Turkish base. Lobbying on their own part. Qatar did a fantastic job in Europe. Qatar also did a good job in the United States. As I said, at the end of the day, billions are spent by all these Gulf countries trying to lobby and make themselves look good. At the end of the day, the only beneficiary is the West. Qatar is obviously been hit by this blockade, but it has not worked. So Qatar is functioning now as normal. The World Cup will be held there, which is a big trouble for Saudis and Emiratis. And this trouble or this conflict is going to continue. It's not going to be short-lived. It's going to continue for a long time.
Concluding remarks? Ghalib Bey, very briefly.
Well, very briefly, I mean, I think, as she said, as he said, we don't have a very positive image in the short term. So the regional collapse and the regional chaos will continue. But I think that on the positive side, what I see is I strongly believe in the power of the political psychology. And there is a new political psychologist, because with Think Tanker and others, when we discuss the region, we focus too much on the individuals and the events. Sometimes we forget the political psychology. In the last 2 or 3 years, I was yesterday just telling to David, all the events that I have been to in the Middle East department of the major Western think tanks, they all, in a sense, turn into major DIE studying center. So, Center for DIE Studies. So, the whole obsession has been to study ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. And this makes them, in a sense, addicted to the presence of ISIS. And to some extent, like, blind them to some of the major trends that is taking place. I see 2 trends. One of them, the political psychology, that despite all the trouble that they have experienced, despite all the challenges that they have experienced, and they are being tamed by the tragedy, they do not accept the old game as their destiny. Right. So this is the most important thing.
We'll continue a second. This is where we end our live transmission. I'd like to thank our viewers in the Balkans, but also in the Middle East who have been watching us for the last 2 hours. It was a pleasure having you. And this whole show will be available on YouTube in the coming days. Thank you so much for your time. We'll of course continue our discussion very briefly. Professor Albasic, would you like to have say something?
Yeah, probably a concluding thought just to leave our audience with something to take away when it comes to understanding all of this. It looks like the way we talk, it looks like it's very mysterious. You can't really get what's going on. Actually, there is a very simple, I think, law that governs everything, which is survival, especially regime survival. What we are seeing, it's all in the name of survival. Now, that in itself, that's what you find in any introductory textbook to political science and international relations. So this is not we just have to go back to that lesson number 1. Now, that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is when there is no price that you are not willing to pay to survive. And this is the difference between, let's say, civilized societies and what we are seeing here. And this brings me to human cost of all of these struggles. And I think everyone, us in the audience, everyone everywhere, I think we should go back and put the human beings and their destiny at the center in our focus. If we manage to do that, I think we are running a better chance of getting out of this sooner and with less suffering. Otherwise, if it is just about regime survival by any means necessary, at any cost, then God help us.
Right. Kemal, final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think the professor was spot on. It's realism and survival. It's unfortunate because the people pay the price for it. Whoever wants to survive in the region, whether it's a government, army, authoritarian or monarchy, they will survive. I think I see an increased militarization of foreign policy, especially with Trump, Mohammed bin Salman and Netanyahu, the 3 musketeers. You know, they could lead the whole region into a complete war, and I think that's where it's heading because, you know, for the first time, it's out in the open, the relationship between Saudi Arabia, Israel and America. And so I feel that they will force their way. Whoever they force their way against will react. And also there's an emerging world. At least in my travels and work in a lot of the Middle East, I see China emerging very fast as the biggest economic, soon to be a big military player. As I mentioned, in Syria, the Chinese military and intelligence are very active. They're active in Sudan, Djibouti. So I think the world is moving fast. If anything, I think NATO and the European countries will not have an answer to it. The future lies east. That east could be China, India, BRICS countries as well. And how the Middle East emerges from that will be interesting because, of course, the Middle East sits right bang in the middle of East and West. So I think that will be interesting.
Right, gentlemen, it was a pleasure having you on the panel today. Thank you so much for your time. We have about 15 minutes left just for 3-4 very brief questions. Please state your name and be concise, please. So we have Ismail and you at back. Okay.
Ismail Chiric, political science student from the International University of Sarajevo. I have a question for Mr. Hurst and Mr. Focho. Mr. Hurst, do you believe that the USA will engage more in the Qatar crisis, especially after Rex Tillerson was sacked? And Mr. Focho, do you believe that Al Jazeera still has the major influence over Arabs 7 years after the Arab Spring and despite the Qatar crisis?
I think after Tillerson's ousting, I think there's going to be more chaos to come. And I would be very interested in seeing whether other pragmatists, they used to be called right-wing, but now they're considered pragmatists, like McMaster, will carry on in his role. I'd be very interested to see whether or not he would be now dispatched to Afghanistan. That's one thing to look for. Again, it's very gloomy, but Trump doesn't care. Trump doesn't know that much, and Trump's umbilical cord is to a feeling of dispossession and anger in one part of American society. He is not connected to the Arabic world and the Middle East, and therefore he's capable of doing a huge amount of damage, not least to the Iranian nuclear deal that we haven't really talked about. There is opposition to that as well, and thank God that opposition to changing the nuclear deal with Iran is in Europe because it's an international treaty, it's not an American treaty, and hopefully there will be pushback, there is pushback from Europe on that. There's also been some pushback from the Israeli general staff who believe that they're not actually ready for a war with Iran and with Hezbollah quite yet. But that is that's a temporary answer. So, but on the Trump side, I'm afraid what you're going to see now is an even more careless and extreme foreign policy.
Well, it is. I will admit that post-Arab Spring, Al Jazeera has maybe lost a little bit of its steam, and this blockade of Qatar, paradoxically, has actually given a new lease of life to Al Jazeera. It became more relevant. It became more, you know, when these countries demanded as one of their conditions for lifting of blockade, shutting down of Al Jazeera, it made Al Jazeera now more interesting, more popular, not only to the West, which is fantastic success for Al Jazeera now, but even to the Arab world. Sure, Al Jazeera is off the cables in Saudi and the Emirati, etc., but it's free-to-air channel and people can access it. So it is, as a matter of fact, Al Jazeera is now in better position than it was. Probably they didn't intend for that, but this is what happened.
Second question was, yeah.
Thank you very much for your insightful opinions on all these areas. I'm not a journalist, so I have really big value for all your opinions because I don't have time to research so much all these topics. I have one big question that's in my head for the past decades. We see throughout the whole past decade, we see that the international community is not so much interested to solve this situation for the best human beings for all of us. We see that in their interest, it is maybe still, and it will be, better to have a chaos in Arabic world, in Eastern Europe maybe. But my question is, when is the time and what is the action that should happen that will wake up the OIC? Would it ever happen, or should new OIC? I would appreciate if our international colleagues could answer, because our local colleagues I can ask later. Thank you very much.
Galip, would you like to take that? Okay. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the major trouble of almost all the regional institutions in the region, including OIC, they were not born to create a platform for further regional integration or cooperation. They were born as a platform of one axis against another axis, and they were very exclusionary in their birth. OIC, okay, one in the Wikipedia, when you look at it, one of the factors that they will cite for the OIC is, the collective commitment to the Jerusalem after, this terrorist attack happens against Al-Quds. But the reality is that the time when the OIC was born was also the time when the Arab nationalism was very strong. OIC, I believe, was born as a Saudi platform where, the Islamism could be a main currency against the Arab nationalism of back then. And you see this with even GCC. GCC is a relatively success story, but GCC was born as a reaction to the Iranian revolution, to war in Afghanistan, etc., etc. So the fact that right now we need to revisit the premise of the regional framework, and unfortunately, right now there isn't time at the elite level. I see no prospect for revisiting any of these regional institutions or framework where they can be a strong platform for some kind of a regional dialogue or etc. Because there is among the major regional powers, the visions of each other are completely contradicting. So it's very hard to get Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, or etc. to put some kind of a common vision for how to govern the region, because they dramatically have different vision for the region, and therefore all the institutions try to be, all of this power trying to utilize the institution as one, fighting medium in their hand against the other plugs. Right. And this is, makes the story a bit more gloomy.
Our final question was, okay.
Well, my name is Nihal Junch. I'm international relations from American University in Boston. I have a question for Mr. Pocho because he's been the most direct in his being a proponent of the Arab Spring. So 7 years later, looking at the whole situation, do you believe that with respect to the original ideas and goals of the protesters, do you believe it has been more of a success or more of a failure? Thank you.
Well, we are not stupid. We know it's not been a success at the moment. We can't say it's a failure because, as David has mentioned in its first answer, this is something that takes time. We can't say, they used to live better before. Because how then far back we will go in history? We can always come to one point when it was not so good or when it was worse. I think... we will send, tada. I think Arab Spring still has some remnants. Tunisia is still functioning. Morocco has been liberalized. Libya eventually may function. It is not doing well, but it may function eventually. It's not failed yet. Unfortunately, Palestine came out to be big loser because of this shift due to internal struggles that again came out from Arab Spring, that Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and Egypt are now being extremely pro-Israeli, and to that extent that they are willing to forgo Jerusalem and let the Israelis officially set it as their capital. But I think the process is not over. And as I said, in 2010, nobody could have foreseen Mubarak losing power. I think this cycle will come again, probably sooner than many think. And the process will continue. How long it will take, we don't know. But I still think Arab Spring was a good thing. And everybody has gone through this. We had traumatic transition here. I mean, save for Syria, which has had far worse casualties. The Bosnian war in this small country had more casualties than the entire Middle East, including Libya, Egypt, Yemen, etc., Iraq. So I think the process is not over yet, and I want to believe that eventually something good will come and happen to these people.
Right. I would like to thank our panelists once again: Kemal Alim from London, Ahmed Al-Bashic from Sarajevo, Galib Dalai from Istanbul, Edhem Focho from Sarajevo, and David Hurst from London. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, dear guests. It was a pleasure having you on the show. All right.
Just give us a few more minutes. I will not repeat and I will not make concluding remarks because this is something they have done. And I thank our panelists for being so elaborate. And I thank you for being able to, to bear with us all the time. Yes, Arab Spring is a very wide topic. And we covered quite a few things. In our next sessions and conferences, we'll try to focus, narrow down. We'll listen to your suggestions. So please follow our website. We'll soon come with our part in the Balkans.aljazeera.net. So, but we ask also another 2 minutes. We just need to hand out our appreciation letter for our partners and for our panelists. I will ask our panelists to keep their seats. Now I will ask our director, Tariq Judges, to hand out the appreciation letters. First, I would like to invite the Memorial Center, Kovaci, to receive the appreciation letter. So, Mr. Suad, if you would be so kind. This way. We thank our Memorial Center for recognizing this effort of ours and for it being important, sending good messages from Sarajevo. Next is our Balkan Studies Center of the International University of Sarajevo, and we'll ask Professor Metin Toprak to take the award. And I thank the students who came in big numbers, not only from International University of Sarajevo, from all other universities, private and public, and also our organizing team. Thank you. And now I would like to invite a representative from Us Holding, the PR person, Madam Andrea Tomasevic, who was with us, our partner as well. Now, I would like to invite the representative from Stratis Strategic Center to receive the letter as well. And now for our panelists, Mr. David Hurst, for being so kind, coming all the way from the UK to accept his appreciation letter.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Galib Darab for his invaluable contributions and help.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kamal Alam, also for being with us and still struggling with the jet lag, I guess.
Thank you. Thanks, inshallah.
Professor Ahmet Alibasic, who simplified things for us at the end so that we have something to take with us from the conference. But also, we were saying it's not black and white. There is a gray area, but some people called we have to call names properly as they are. So, Mr. Edhem Focho also to accept the appreciation letter.
Well,
So I would like to ask all our speakers to keep the seats, and we'll just go in the background to take the photo session all together. So thank you very much. We'll listen to your suggestions. Thank you for your time, and please follow our post. We'll keep you posted. Thank you.